all humans without exception who have been born and have died since the beginning of creation are either in heaven or in hell. First of all, this follows from what was said and explained in the preceding chapter, namely, that heaven and hell come from humankind. Second, it follows from the fact that after life in the physical world everyone goes on living to eternity. Third, this means that every human who has ever been born and has died since the creation of the world is either in heaven or in hell. Fourth, since everyone who is going to be born from now on is also going to enter the spiritual world, clearly that world is so extraordinary in both size and nature that this physical world, where people live on various planets, cannot be compared to it. To give a better feel for this and a clearer view of it, I would like to present and develop these points one at a time. As for the fact that all people without exception who have been born and have died since the beginning of the creation of the world are either in heaven or in hell, no explanation is needed to see that this follows from what was said and explained in the preceding chapter, namely, that heaven and hell come from humankind. Until the present time, the most commonly held belief has been that we will not get to heaven or hell before the day of the last judgment, when souls will be reunited with their bodies and therefore enjoy the faculties believed to belong exclusively to the body. Many ordinary people have adopted this belief on the authority of those who have hypothesized about the nature of what lies within us and have published their supposed wisdom. Since these individuals give no thought at all to the existence of a spiritual world, but only consider the earthly one, and therefore do not think in terms of the spiritual self, they have not realized that the spiritual self each of us has within our earthly self is just as human in form as the earthly self is. So even though they are capable of seeing that the spiritual self is active at will throughout the earthly self and in its every detail and that the earthly self does absolutely nothing on its own, it has not crossed their minds that the earthly self gets its human form from the spiritual self. It is the spiritual self that thinks and wills, since on its own the earthly self cannot do so, and yet the thinking and willing of the spiritual self are vital to the earthly self. The earthly self does what the spiritual self wills, and says what the spiritual self thinks, so completely that there is no action without some will and no speech without some thought. This is because if you take away the thought and the will, the speech and action instantly cease. We can see from this that the spiritual self is the true self and that it is present in each and every detail of the earthly self. This means that the earthly self is an image of the spiritual self, because any part or particle of the earthly self in which the spiritual self is not active is not alive. Nevertheless, the spiritual self cannot be visible to the earthly self, because what is earthly cannot see what is spiritual. What is spiritual can see what is earthly, though this is in keeping with the divine design, but the reverse is not. Therefore there is an inflow from what is spiritual into what is earthly but not the reverse, and this applies to our ability to see, because sight flows in as well. Our spiritual self is what is called our spirit. It is visible in the spiritual world in a complete human form, and it lives on after death. Because the great thinkers have known nothing about the spiritual world and nothing about the human spirit, as already noted, they have embraced the idea that we cannot live as human beings until our souls get back into our bodies and once again have physical senses. This has given rise to ridiculous notions about our resurrection that even though our bodies have been eaten by worms and fish and have completely disintegrated into dust, they will be put back together again by divine omnipotence and reunited with our souls, and that this will not happen until the end of the world, when the physical universe will be destroyed. There are other similar notions as well, all of which defy comprehension and which the mind immediately recognizes as impossible and in violation of the divine design. So these notions have undermined many people's faith, since anyone whose thinking is based on wisdom cannot believe something that is utterly incomprehensible. There is no such thing as faith in impossibilities, that is, in things that we regard as impossible. Furthermore, people who do not believe in life after death use the absurdity of these notions as support for their denial. Support for the fact that we do rise again immediately after death and that we are then in a complete human form is given in a number of chapters in Heaven and Hell. I mention all this as further reinforcement for the idea that heaven and hell come from humankind, and from this it follows that all humans without exception who have been born and have died since the beginning of creation are either in heaven or in hell. As for the fact that after life in the physical world everyone goes on living to eternity, this follows from the fact that we are then spiritual and no longer earthly, and that the spiritual self separated from the earthly retains its essential nature to eternity because our state cannot be changed after death. Further, everyone's spiritual self is joined to the divine, since it can think about the divine, and can also love the divine and be drawn to everything that comes from the divine, such as the teachings of the Church. This means it can be united to the divine in its thinking and willing, and these two abilities are the spiritual self and constitute its life. Anything that can be joined to the divine in this way cannot ever die, because the divine is present with it and joins it to itself. For another thing, on the level of our mind we have been created in the form of heaven, and the form of heaven is from the divine itself, as you can tell from material in heaven and hell. See, it is the Lord's divine nature that makes and forms heaven, on the fact that each of us has been created to be a heaven in least form. The whole heaven, grasped as a single entity, reflects a single individual, and therefore, every angel is in perfect human form. In fact, our spiritual self is an angel. I have often talked with angels about this, and they have been amazed that if you look at the people in the Christian world who are called intelligent and whom others believe actually are intelligent, you find many who have completely discarded from their faith any idea of immortality in regard to their own life. They believe that the human soul dissipates at death just like the soul of an animal. They do not see any difference between the life in humans and the life in animals, namely, that we are able to think of things beyond ourselves such as God, heaven, love, faith, what is spiritually and morally good, what is true, and the like, and in so doing be raised up toward the divine itself and be joined to it by all these means. Animals, on the other hand, cannot be raised above their own earthly nature to think about things like this, so their spiritual nature cannot be separated from their earthly nature after death for and live on its own the way our spiritual self can. This is why an animal's life is dissipated when its earthly life is over. Angels told me that the reason many of the so-called intelligent in the Christian world do not believe that their own life will be immortal is that at heart they deny the divine and credit everything to nature instead, and people who base their thinking on this premise cannot conceive of any eternity through being joined to the divine. As a result, they cannot conceive of any difference between our state and the state of animals, since once the divine has been eliminated from their thinking, eternity has been eliminated as well. Angels have also said that there is within every human an innermost or highest level of life or an innermost and highest something where the divine nature of the Lord flows in first and most intimately. From this highest point the Lord arranges the other things within us that make up our spiritual and earthly selves, descending level by level in accord with the way we are designed. The angels called this innermost or highest something the Lord's gateway to us and his quintessential dwelling within us. They also said that this innermost or highest something is what makes us human and distinguishes us from mere animals, which do not have it, and that this is why we, unlike animals, can have our inner levels, our higher and lower mind raised by the Lord to himself. This allows us to believe in him, be moved with love for him, and be granted intelligence and wisdom and the ability to speak on the basis of reason. Asked whether people live forever if they deny the divine and reject divine truths, which are the means by which our lives are united to the divine, The angels said that such people, just like those who acknowledge the divine, retain the ability to think and intend and therefore to believe and love the kinds of things that come from the divine, and that this is the ability that makes it possible for them to live to eternity like everyone else. The angels added that this ability comes to people from that aforementioned innermost or highest something that everyone has. They gave extensive evidence that even the people in hell have this ability, and that it is the source of their ability to argue and speak against divine truths. That is why everyone, regardless of what they are like, lives to eternity. Since everyone lives forever after death, no angel, no spirit, even has any thought whatever about death. They do not even know what dying is. So when death is mentioned in the word, angels take it to mean either damnation, which is spiritual death, or else ongoing life and resurrection. All this has been said to make the point that all humans without exception who have been born and have died since the beginning of creation are alive, some in heaven and some in hell. So that I might know that all humans without exception who have been born and have died since the beginning of creation are either in heaven or in hell, I have been allowed to talk with people from many ages, some of whom lived before the flood and some of whom lived after the flood, as well as with people of the Jewish nation known to us from the word of the Old Testament, with some of those who lived at the time of the Lord, and with many of those who lived in later centuries right up to the present day. In addition, I have talked after their deaths with all the people I had known during their physical lives. I have also talked with little children who had died, and with many people of other religions. This experience has utterly convinced me that there is not one human who has ever been born since the first creation of this planet who is not either in heaven or in hell. Since everyone who is going to be born from now on is also going to enter the spiritual world, clearly that world is so extraordinary in both size and nature that this physical world, where people live on various planets, cannot be compared to it. This follows from the vast multitude of people who have made the transition into the spiritual world since creation first occurred and who are now all there at once, as well as from the constant increase still to come as a result of humankind entering from now on, and this without end, as was shown in an earlier chapter. The reproduction of humankind on earth will never cease. Several times when my eyes have been opened I have been granted glimpses of the vast multitude of people there, already so many that they could scarcely be numbered, myriad upon myriad, and this in just one section of one region. How many must there be, then, in all the rest? You see, the people there are all gathered into communities, and there are a great many communities. Each one is in its own place and contributes to form 3 heavens and 3 hells beneath them. This means that one kind of people lives in the heights there, another in the middle elevations, another below them, and another in the lowest regions or hells underneath. Somewhat the way people in this world live in cities, people in the higher regions there live near each other, up to hundreds of thousands together. Therefore, given the sheer quantity of human inhabitants there, clearly this physical world, where people live on various planets, cannot be compared to it. When someone from this earthly world crosses over into the spiritual world, it is like moving from a village to a great city. In quality as well, the spiritual world is beyond comparison with this world. This becomes clear from the fact that all the things that exist in the physical world are found in the spiritual world as well, but in addition there are countless other things there, things that have never been seen and could never be seen here. This is because all the spiritual things in that world are embodied in their own unique way in a form that appears to be earthly, and these forms are infinitely varied. The cause underlying this fact in turn is that what is spiritual is so much more exquisite than what is earthly that very little of it can be brought forth to our earthly senses, since our earthly senses cannot take in even 1,000th of what the spiritual mind takes in, yet everything that happens in the spiritual mind is presented to spirits in visible form. This is why there is no way to describe how wonderful and stunning the spiritual world is. These characteristics are intensified, too, as the number of people in the heavens grows, since everything seen there is presented in forms corresponding to the states of each individual's love and faith and consequent intelligence and wisdom. So the variety of things there is constantly increasing in proportion to the increase in population. This is why people who have been raised into heaven say that they have seen and heard there what no eye has ever seen and no ear has ever heard. All this may serve to show that by nature the spiritual world is such that the physical world cannot be compared to it. For more on the nature of that world, see Heaven and Hell, where it deals with heaven's two kingdoms, heaven's communities, representations and appearances in heaven, and the wisdom of heaven's angels. But even there, only a very few features are described. A last judgment must take place where everyone is together, so it must take place in the spiritual world, and not in the physical world. What people believe concerning the last judgment is that the Lord will then appear in glory in the clouds of heaven, accompanied by angels, and that he will raise from their burial places all the people who have lived since the beginning of creation. He will clothe their souls with their bodies again, and having called them all together will judge them, sending those who have done good things to eternal life or heaven and those who have done evil things to eternal death or hell. The churches have extracted this belief from their literal reading of the word, too, and there has been no way to get rid of it as long as people do not realize that there is a spiritual meaning in absolutely everything the word says, and that this meaning is the essential word, the meaning for which the literal meaning serves as a foundation or basis. We need to realize also that if it were not for this kind of literal meaning, the word could not be divine and serve as a source of teaching about life and faith for both heaven and the world and join the two worlds together. If we know that there are spiritual things that correspond to the earthly things mentioned in the word, then we are in a position to know that the Lord's coming in the clouds of heaven does not mean that he will be revealed in the clouds, but that he will be revealed in the word. The Lord is the word because he is divine truth. The clouds of heaven in which he is to come are the literal meaning of the word, and the glory is its spiritual meaning. The angels that will accompany him mean that heaven is involved in this revelation. They also mean the divine truths that come from the Lord. We can therefore see what these words mean, that at the end of the church the Lord is going to disclose the spiritual meaning of the word and reveal the actual nature of divine truth. So this is a sign that the last judgment is at hand. On the presence of spiritual meaning within everything mentioned in the word, even within every single word of the text, and on what that meaning is like, see Secrets of Heaven, where there is a detailed explanation of everything in Genesis and Exodus according to that meaning. For a collection of references assembled from that work concerning the word and its spiritual meaning, see the booklet The White Horse described in Revelation. On the point that the last judgment must take place in the spiritual world and not on earth or in the physical world, this follows from the two preceding chapters, as well as from chapters yet to come. The two preceding chapters explained that heaven and hell come from humankind and that all humans without exception who have been born and have died since the beginning of creation are either in heaven or in hell, so they are all together in that world. In chapters yet to come, we reach the point at which it is necessary to show that the last judgment has already taken place. Add to this that none of us is judged on the basis of our earthly self, therefore we are not judged while we are still living in the physical world, because during that time we are in our earthly body. Rather, we are judged on the basis of our spiritual self, so our judgment occurs when we have come into the spiritual world, because then we are in our spiritual body. It is our spiritual nature that is judged, not our earthly nature, since our earthly nature is not accountable for any blame or crime, because it has no life of its own, it is simply a tool or an instrument through which the spiritual self acts. That leads us to another reason why judgment is carried out on us when we have put off our earthly body and put on our spiritual one. When we are in our spiritual body, others can actually see what our love and faith are really like, because in the spiritual world all of us are an embodiment of what we love, not only in face and body but also in speech and actions. That is why in that world you can tell what people are really like, and why people can be sorted instantly whenever it pleases the Lord. From these points as well we can see that judgment takes place in the spiritual world and not on earth or in the physical world. The physical life in us counts for nothing. It is the spiritual life that lies within our physical life that counts, since in its own right our earthly self is devoid of life. The life it seems to have comes from the life in our spiritual self. So it is our spiritual self that is judged. In fact, when the word speaks of our being judged according to our actions, it means that it is the spiritual self, behind our actions that is judged. See the chapter in Heaven and Hell titled Our Nature After Death Depends on the Kind of Life We Led in the World. I would like to add here a secret of heaven that I touched on in Heaven and Hell but have not yet fully described. After death, each of us is connected to a particular community, and this is done as soon as we arrive in the spiritual world. In our first state as spirits, though, we are unaware of this, because at that point we are still focused on what is external and not yet on what is internal. As long as we are in this state we go here and there, wherever we feel like going. In actuality, though, we are where our love is, that is, in the community of people who have the same kind of love we have. When we as spirits are in this state we appear in many different places, just as though we were physically present there. This is only the way it seems, though, because as soon as the Lord brings us into our dominant love, we immediately vanish from the sight of others and find ourselves with kindred spirits in the community to which we have been connected. This is a unique feature of the spiritual world and bewilders people who do not understand its underlying cause. Thus it is, then, that as soon as spirits have been gathered and sorted, they are also judged, and they all appear immediately in their own proper places. The good are in heaven, in the communities where their kindred spirits are, and the evil are in hell, in the communities where their kindred spirits are. From these points as well it follows that a last judgment can take place only in the spiritual world, both because in that world we are all an embodiment of the life that is within us, and because we are surrounded there by people who have a similar life within them. Everyone is among kindred spirits. It is different in this earthly world where good and evil people can be together, neither really knowing what the other is like. Here we are not spontaneously sorted out according to our life's love. In fact, none of us can bring our earthly bodies with us into heaven or into hell, so in order for us to arrive at either destination, we need to shed our earthly bodies and after that, be judged in our spiritual bodies. That is why, as stated above, it is our spiritual self that is judged, and not our earthly self.